Welcome to Upon Further Review, your bi-monthly snapshot and discussion of sports in the age of COVID. I'm Ty Henry.
And I'm Matt Zemek.
Matt, we've got some news today. We have an interview coming up with Chad Conine and also with Richard Obert about some news in Arizona and also with Kim Mulkey. But top story right now going on is the NBA and COVID, and it seems there's a bit of COVID fatigue going on in the league. The Sixers, first Seth Curry, and then there was a cascading series of issues with multiple teams, including the Celtics. Delve into what you've read on the subject, and let's discuss it a little bit.
Yeah, so I have the strong sense that in the NBA, most people are talking about the Philadelphia 76ers since Joel Embiid has had to quarantine, and he has a baby on the way, and he's needing to have that in mind in terms of the safety of his future child and his partner. That's an issue unto itself. But then the Sixers have been hit by COVID, Seth Curry in particular. And for some reason, the NBA insisted on having the Sixers and Nuggets play an afternoon game on Saturday, January 9, despite all of these uncertainties swirling around, and the Sixers basically putting out like maybe a G League deluxe lineup, at least a starting five on the floor against the Nuggets. That calls to question rather the competitive integrity of that particular Sixers Nuggets game. The NBA is just kind of wanting to keep the trains moving. It's reminiscent of what the NFL did by preventing the Denver Broncos' entire quarterback room from playing against the Saints, and Denver had to sign Kendall Hinton, a receiver who had played quarterback at Wake Forest. They had to sign him off the streets and just bring him in. The NFL insisted on playing that game Sunday afternoon. It didn't delay the game until Tuesday or Wednesday, which we had seen the NFL do for, better teams. Hint, hint. The NFL really has seemed to conveniently adjust its standards and its levels of flexibility depending on how good the team involved was. Mm-hmm. And so with the NBA, we're getting a similar reality that the NBA just seems to push these games through instead of calling them off if there are real doubts about the extent of COVID spread on a team. We do not have ironclad, solid information about just how much COVID has spread on the Sixers and how much every player is at risk. And, this isn't the NFL where you have one game a week. This is, just games every other day.
And these guys are vectors. These guys are vectors. They're moving. This is no longer a bubble situation. These guys are vectors, and so are the surrounding staff around them. So they're moving from state to state. They're moving from city to city. They're moving from hotel to hotel. And they have some COVID protocols, so to speak, but you are at the risk of, if you were a player on a team, of what that player's family might have done the week before.
Yes, and the movement from game to game and city to city, it really just seems as though the NBA is playing Russian roulette right now. And just to make the big connection here, Ty, the Sixers are the talk of the NBA in terms of COVID. Like the Sixers in these first 10 days of January are what the Houston Rockets were in the first week of the NBA season near Christmas with James Harden, Boogie Cousins, and others. So the Rockets were the COVID team in late December. The Sixers are the COVID team in early January, but flying under the radar precisely because of Joel Embiid's high-profile COVID situation with his new family. The Washington Wizards, they're not getting the same amount of national discussion and notice in terms of NBA COVID concerns, but Justin Russo, who is on Twitter at Flyby Night, and he spells night Knite, Flyby Knite, he noted this earlier on Saturday. He said that he noted that on January 3rd, the Washington Wizards played the Brooklyn Nets, and on January 5th, Kevin Durant had to quarantine for a week. He then noted that on January 6th, the Wizards played the Sixers. On January 7th, several 76ers players had to quarantine. And then Justin Russo also pointed out that on Friday, January 8th, the Wizards played the Celtics. And then on Saturday, January 9th, Jason Tatum had to quarantine. So connect the dots, Ty, do the math. It certainly seems as though there is a spreader effect coming from the Wizards to some degree, and the NBA does not seem to be on top of that situation. And that goes into, why did the Sixers and Nuggets absolutely have to play on Saturday while the NBA has not really locked down and determined conclusively that the Washington Wizards are not spreading COVID-19 to other NBA teams.
Let me jump in here. I see Fred Katz here, who is who's also the Wizards. He's host of Wizards After Dark, a Wizards post-game podcast. Bulls cases popped up during the series with the Wizards. Durant quarantine was right after the Nets Wizards. Now it's Philadelphia, where the Wizards played last night. So we have another podcaster and broadcaster who has sort of picked up on this. It's interesting because when you talk about the NBA, basketball is a sport where you can reschedule on the fly. It's not a high contact sport in terms of collisions. So you don't have a whole lot of people getting seriously injured and sore after the games. You can kind of move games around. And you don't need as much lead time. You can play multiple games in a day if you wanted to. So it seems like they could have some delay, and you don't have fans in most of these places. Which of these places, in terms of the Bulls? I'm sorry. Let's take the Wizards. Do the Wizards, do the Nets, or are the Boston Celtics or the Philly 76ers having any fans in the stadiums? I know that the Los Angeles Lakers have decided they're not going to have any. So,
not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I mean, I think Adam Silver was pretty clear that, before the vaccine arrived, that fans was in arenas was just not doable. I mean, he sounded notes of hopeful optimism before the season began, but as COVID intensified, coming up to the December 22 start date of the season, Silver walked that back and said, "Well, we wanted to, but no, it's not going to happen." And I should say, Ty, that on the heels of saying that, I remain perplexed, not because, I'm surprised the NBA wanted that Christmas Day TV money. That's obviously was the reason the season started on December 22nd. I'm not surprised by that. What I am surprised by is the felt need to have to start the season when the NBA did, and instead of waiting for the vaccine rollout to occur, because I look, Christmas Day television is a valuable property for the NBA. There's no question about that. And also, I get that, the NBA wants to be able to have its players compete at the Tokyo Olympics this upcoming summer, assuming we do have an Olympics. So that was also a reason to cram in this NBA schedule before Tokyo. But in terms of economics, which that it is the main concern, it's the main reason college and football and the NFL insisted on playing right through the pandemic. Damn the torpedoes. Just from a strictly economic point of view, I fail to understand why the NBA had to start when it did, because if we get the vaccine distributed to a lot more people in, let's say, April, I mean, we're not going to hit the desired target, but we will have many tens of millions of more Americans vaccinated by then. And so if you're the NBA, why not wait the extra few months to start your 2021 season? Okay, so you don't get Christmas Day television, but you can begin to have fans in the seats, maybe not at the start of the season, but certainly in the middle of the season. But under the current circumstances, it's hard to see how you're going to have fans in the stands anytime soon. So, if you move the season back 3 months, but you can get fans in the stands for a much bigger chunk of your regular season, and then for all of your postseason, aren't you ultimately making a lot more money than if you start right now and you get that Christmas Day TV set?
Well, I can sort of see splitting the baby here, Matt, in terms of let's have the Christmas Day games and then have a delay. So kind of whet people's appetite, get that Christmas Day money, maybe play a game a week from time to time, but not play a full schedule, and then sort of have a fall back for a while. Because what do you have? You have the college football playoff, you have the NFL playoffs going on. So there's plenty for the sports fans, and then kind of pick things up mid-January, late January. Do you think maybe the NBA should have thought about that a little bit as well? Or what do you think about that type of idea or that type of arrangement?
Well, doing something like that, it would have a pronounced stop and start quality to it. And, I cover USC basketball, and USC basketball was shut down for 3 weeks because of COVID-19. Now, USC's playing better after its restart. And so it had an interruption, it dealt with it, and the season still moved on. So, the idea that having a 3-week in between period, where you play Christmas Day TV games and then you go quiet or almost completely quiet for 3 weeks. A lot of people are going to scratch their heads on that, but this is a pandemic.
Right.
There's no set way to do it. Like there's no law saying you have to do a fully normal schedule. I mean, so that idea, people will at first go, what? But really, when you think about it, why not? Why can't you manipulate your schedule in untraditional ways so that you're getting, maybe not all of what you want, but more of what you want? And so the NBA just going full speed ahead with a normal rhythm schedule here in January when fans can't attend because the vaccine rollout is both slow and still in its relatively early stages. It just seems to me that the NBA is throwing away the chance to push back its season and get a lot more game dates with fans able to attend in the summer. I mean, it just seems as though the NBA is so fixed to the idea of having its normal calendar that it's forsaking some potential opportunities to make more revenue. I mean, it seems, Ty, that the NBA's desire to start the season when it did was not just to get Christmas money and not just to fit it in before Tokyo and the Olympics, but also to eventually get the league back to that normal October through June calendar for 2021, 2022, to get back into that rhythm. And when the bubble playoffs were occurring, I was not the only person to arrive at the realization of, wait a minute, the NBA playing through July and August, usually the deadest, dullest months of the sports year, that's actually pretty darn cool. We get showcase postseason basketball during the dog days, and then it ends right when the NFL season gets going. That's actually a pretty good rearrangement of the calendar.
Yeah, it might be a good paradigm shift because all we have, we're tennis fans, so we have Wimbledon during the summer, but not everybody's a tennis fan, right? And we have soccer fans, and that's a busy period, but that's not huge in the United States. So we're in the second act of the baseball season as well.
Yeah, now, maybe you and I are the weird people and everyone else is, smart and sane. But to me, Ty, having an NBA and also NHL season, which began right after the NFL's conference championship games in late January and then goes through August or, maybe Labor Day weekend right before the NFL starts up again, you're claiming the 8 months of the year in which the NFL isn't playing. That seems to be perfect for what the NBA and the NHL should be doing. I mean, that seems to me like the ideal calendar arrangement for your sports, and they're not doing it. I just don't get it.
We had a lot of social justice and economic and racial justice was actually put to the fore. And as Kyle Kalinske likes to say, and we all know that they will cave on the symbolism first about the care for Black athletes and people of color and for racial justice and for moving the society forward and advancing in these matters. But then you have a situation where it harkens back to the old, and this isn't the same, obviously, because, but but the Tuskegee experiment where they actually put viruses in people and saw what happened to them. This isn't the same thing. We know it's a pandemic, but this is a situation where there's a sort of disconnect here because, one, you're putting players at risk before having a full offseason, which has, I think, diminished the quality of the product as a fan because teams haven't had a chance to, guys haven't had a chance to relax, have an off season, let their bodies heal, and then develop some chemistry with their teammates and have a training camp with these young players and implement them, but also implement these new protocols in keeping with what we all knew was going to be a spike period subsequent to Thanksgiving and Christmas, and a large number of the populace being sort of recalcitrant and having COVID fatigue and being able to adapt to that after the fact and have some time to put some protocols in.
Oh, I mean, one thing you touched on in what you just said, Ty, was was fatigue, and of course that's not just physical; it's also mental. And I mean, even Americans just the reality of being at home and not being able to socialize face to face with friends, people you love, that's fatiguing. That is emotionally exhausting to be deprived of that. And so, these NBA players with the 2 month off season, not only did, specifically for the Lakers and the Heat, also for the Celtics and the Nuggets, the other teams that made the conference finals, not only is physical fatigue a real thing with them. I mean, the Miami Heat, you can tell, they're just dragging through the first few weeks of the season.
That's the first team I thought about. That's the first team I thought about.
Totally predictable. It's not an indictment on any of those players. Like, none of them should be criticized for this. They were thrown into this situation. I'm really surprised that the NBA Players Union didn't put up a much bigger fight. But anyway, it's not just physical fatigue. It's also the mental fatigue. And, there's so much research and study in sports medicine today. And the NBA itself has been part of this. Why are there fewer back-to-backs? Why are games more spread out? Why did the regular season move into mid-October? It used to start in early November, but a few years ago it was pushed up to mid-October. Why? So that you have more open dates in the season and you have far fewer instances of back-to-backs, also far fewer instances of 4 games in 5 nights. That's another thing the NBA over the past 6-7 years has worked really hard to reduce. And that's to the NBA's credit. But the point is the NBA knows that giving players adequate rest, adequate time to replenish, revive, get enough sleep, get into a city at a decent hour and be able to have some time to decompress between all the games that they're playing.
Improves the product.
The NBA knows this, and yet it still wanted to throw these players back into the arena well before they were either physically or emotionally ready. I think that's a scandal, but you're just not seeing it because, hey, TV money, got to keep the industry going. And hey, I'm a sports writer. I mean, sports continuing, that fills my wallet. So, I mean, I get it. And I admit that I've benefited to this from some extent, but that shouldn't make me silent on this. It really still is, to me, a moral and ethical scandal.
Moving on to the college game, Clemson updates COVID-19 impact on athletic program from the TigerNet staff. Clemson Athletics reported 1,466 COVID-19 PCR tests on athletes and staff between January 1st and 7th. A total of 15 individuals tested positive, 9 staff and 6 athletes are 1% positive, which is actually sort of high. Since June 1, per the school, Clemson athletes and athletic staff have completed 25,000 with 0.9% positive and no hospitalizations. That's good news. We did have a game postponed because of some test issues with the North Carolina Tar Heels. So that game has been put back, but it brings to question what happened maybe in the last week or so, and what would have happened if Clemson would have had to play in the national championship game with this game have been postponed.
Well, I mean, Clemson basketball is going through an outbreak that isn't just not just this North Carolina game on Saturday, but Clemson's game next week has also been postponed, and it just goes to the point that you know for colleges you're seeing clusters of postponements. You're seeing 2 or 3 game sequences being adjusted. And in the NBA, you're not really seeing the same thing. You're seeing instances of players having to sit out, and in some cases, superstars such as Kevin Durant, Jason Tatum, but you're not seeing games being moved around. And it just throws the competitive integrity of this process into question. And we even saw this in tennis at the U.S. Open, where if Daniil Medvedev quite conceivably could have been ruled out, but he was not treated the same way that other lower ranked players
Benoit
were.
Paire.
Same for Alexander
Benoit Paire,
Zverev
yep. Mm-hmm.
as well. There were situations involving players of very different rankings, very different levels of status, and you can't say with a straight face that they were handled the same way. And I mean, so the tournament was completed, much as it seems that the NFL and college football are going to somehow complete their seasons. And fair play here. Congratulations to these leagues for somehow getting through it when a lot of people thought, oh, didn't have a chance. That's true, but still, when you have such imbalances in competitive integrity and you bend the rules for one person or one team over here and you don't cut another team the same amount of slack over there, it does put a significant stain over the whole process. And I just hope that fans realize that, hey, all this is happening so that owners and sports organizations can make a buck. It's really has not been fully accommodating to the athletes, and of course, especially at the collegiate level, where once again, as I'll always say when we get into a discussion of college sports in a pandemic, hazard pay to the athletes has still not been extended.
Moving on to, there's a press release from the Pac-12 a couple of days ago. I don't know if you had a chance to read it, Matt, but the headline is Pac-12 contributes to important new research findings to shorten COVID-19 quarantine periods for student athletes. And the state line January the 7th. In collaboration with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Pac-12 conference contributed to research which has informed database quarantine recommendations for individuals exposed to COVID-19. The Pac-12 was able to contribute to this research through its members' dedication to implementation of daily testing protocols. The findings of the project, which has included data from multiple NCAA conferences, informed that the most recent recommendations of the CDC, reducing recommended quarantine periods for individuals identified as close contacts given the limited risk for transmission after 10 days following exposure. So the question is, how soon are some of these findings going to be implemented into both the Pac-12 and the general practices of the colleges around the country? Because we're getting new data, we're getting new information. This is always a fluid situation. Have you heard anything about adaptations and protocols in the Pac-12 and in the general college landscape?
Yeah, when the CDC recently, in its guidelines, this was a few weeks ago, so around Christmas, the CDC said that it was going to shorten its recommended quarantine period, and in conjunction with that, you're seeing a slight decrease in the raw overall numbers of game postponements. Like DePaul, for example. DePaul didn't play his first game until I think well into December. Like the DePaul didn't play for like a month. But DePaul's played since then, and I think that and other somewhat similar comparable instances of teams finally playing around Christmas, late December, early January, after not playing barely at all for the first month of the college basketball season. I think you can connect most of those instances to the CDC reducing the quarantine period. So there's some degree of national coordination on this, and there's some sense in the college basketball community that the length of the quarantines was simply too long, and it was choking off a lot of seasons. So you're seeing programs using this to play more games. How the Pac-12 is specifically reacting in its own way to this, and it's still an evolving picture. It is worth noting that, again, as I said earlier in the show, USC did go 3 weeks without playing a game from around December 8th through the 29th. So how USC fits into that picture. I'm not entirely sure, but it just seems as that compared to early December, college basketball programs wanted to have shorter quarantine periods, and the CDC regulations did become more lenient, and it's led to a slight reduction in the overall postponements you're seeing across the country.
Moving on to college women's basketball, two of the hegemons of the sport have been impacted by COVID-19 in recent weeks. Just this past week, Kim Mulkey, the head coach of the Baylor Bears, multi-national championship winning coach and player, Hall of Famer Kim Mulkey, tested positive after coming back from contact tracing protocols to team activities. And so those team activities have been paused. We're going to have Chad Conine to discuss more of that a little bit later. But they lost a big game against UConn, which is obviously the 800-pound gorilla in women's basketball over the course of the past 20 years. And of course, the previous week, Duke became the first women's basketball team to cancel an entire season. Carol Lawson, this is her first season, former All-American and All-Conference performer from Tennessee. This is going to be her first season at the Duke head, and it has to be really gut-wrenching, but they did have some COVID issues with a couple of players on the team. So at the top of women's basketball, we're seeing some impacts, and of course that falls on the heels of Chicago State being the first men's basketball team, but no really prominent men's basketball teams, as I know of, have canceled their seasons. Obviously, we have the balance of the revenue versus the risk reward. So, Matt, do you anticipate in the coming weeks, if there's not an absolute shutdown that comes from the top down, that is to say a governor or a college president, do you foresee any top programs shutting it down? And if so, where would you see those first?
I don't see it happening at the top programs. I see it happening actually from the bottom up rather than from the top down. A really good example here, Ty, San Jose State. The Spartans are 2-6. They've had some players enter the transfer portal, and so if you get kind of a frayed situation where the losses pile up, one or two players enter the transfer portal, and just the larger situation on a team begins to disintegrate. I think you're going to see some lower end teams just say, "Hey, we're not jumping on a plane 10 more times, through the middle of winter. We'll just call it a day." Now, the interesting question would be, how will the conferences and their high end teams with NCAA tournament aspirations, how would they react to something like that? Like San Diego State in the Mountain West, can't play San Jose State and get a couple wins on its schedule. How would the Aztecs feel about that? They wouldn't get 2 conference wins on their resume. How is all that going to be handled? But I don't think like San Diego State can prevent San Jose State, and I don't think that like a high end team in a Power 5 conference can really stand in the way of a bottom feeding team from opting out of its season. I mean, Duke in women's basketball, obviously Duke isn't nearly as good as it was a decade and a half ago when the Blue Devils made the national championship game and lost to Maryland. Duke's not really that high profile a women's program anymore in the ACC, but nevertheless, I mean, what are the other member schools going to do in the conference? They're going to say, no, you can't do it? Not really. So, and I think that if teams think that putting their players through this grinder when the season is evaporating for them, losses, transfers, and just overall misery. Hey, if these athletes aren't getting hazard pay, why indeed should they insist on completing their full schedule? So I think we're going to see teams opting out from the bottom up, not from the top down.
Last question, Matt. Following up on what you just said, do you see a acceleration of players entering the transfer portal in both football, basketball, and women's basketball over the course of the pandemic, just in the past couple of months, that you saw in contrast to what you've seen in other seasons and other portions of seasons?
Absolutely. And I think that just goes to the point. This is especially germane in football, where it's already been firmly established that players can get a bonus year of eligibility next year. It's going to be a free for all, and you're going to see overloaded rosters. And I think it's
how they're going to deal with the bottleneck. That's the question. Is how? Yeah. Go ahead and go into that. How they're going to deal with the bottleneck.
So I think it's not so much a question of if you're going to see a ton of transfer portal activity. That's definitely going to happen. It's more going to be about how are players going to do this. Are they going to see, that high profile player is transferring to that school, so I can now transfer to the school that player left. It's going to be free agency without guys getting paid. I mean, it's going to be
musical chairs.
The closest thing we've ever had to college sports free agency.
Yeah, it's going to be musical chairs.
Absolutely.
That does it for this episode of Upon Further Review. And until next time, learn more, share more, think more, care more.